Hello, and welcome to Let's Talk Transformation. I'm Susie Lewis, your host, and today we're going to be discussing something that most leadership development programs never explicitly prepare you for. So it's not about market volatility or the pace of technology change, although that would be good. It's about this: power, personalities, and what's happening in your meeting rooms. So somewhere in your organization, quite possibly in your leadership team, there is someone who's extraordinarily skilled at making your life harder. Not by accident, but on purpose. And they're also probably quite likable. So today's guest has spent decades inside large corporations watching this play out. He's a senior business consultant, director of Nexoid, and most importantly for this conversation, the author of the book, The Corporate Sociopath Handbook. And before you picture some sensationalist takedown of really bad people, let me tell you, this book is one of the most pragmatic, useful, and honestly a little bit scary in what you experience and identify with as you read it. So, Jonathon, welcome to Let's Talk Transformation.
Thank you, Susie, for having me. What a fantastic intro.
It's a pleasure to have you on the show, Jonathon. Jonathon, you wrote a handbook. Most handbooks are about how to do things right, in inverted commas. Yours is about how to navigate and survive the people who are doing things strategically wrong. So can we start there? Where did this idea come from, and why did you write your book?
So, a bit of a nasty personal story, actually. I was living in the UK and we got the phone call. Sorry for your listeners, I'm currently in Adelaide in South Australia. Got the phone call, mum was ill, and 24 hours later, where the partner and I are flying back to Adelaide, and we supported mum and the family through 18 months of brain cancer, which is horrific. As part of that, though, you're obviously sort of very busy with doctor's appointments and stuff like that, but you also have a lot of downtime. And you go, okay, well, I need to do something to stop myself from going mad. So I started writing some memoirs, and it was originally meant to be just sort of, here's my life, and here are the bits at least I find interesting. And I started writing little bits, and the bits that I wrote, they all had a bit of a theme. They were all stories from contracting. They were all stories from the corporate world where, let's say, they're a bit immoral, unethical, something nasty happened. And I shared this with a few people, and they seemed to like it. It was a side that people don't talk about. It's a side that we're all aware exists, but I don't know. There's a culture where if we don't talk about it, it's not real.
I know, but they're all very relatable. And like you say, it's things we never say, but that we totally identify with.
As I kept collecting these stories, I sort of went, oh dear, I'm writing a very, very different book. I showed it to a few author friends of mine, and they all kind of agreed, going, yeah, you're not writing memoirs at this point. And then at that point, we just committed. It was like, okay, let's expand on that. But it was a really interesting process. A lot of it I knew before writing, but also the research process of going, okay, which bits have I missed, which bits have I not experienced, was really, really interesting.
It's interesting. We'll come back to what was the most transformative for you about that process. But before we label anyone a sociopath, Jonathon, can you help us understand what we're actually talking about? And I'm going to take, what are the dark five that you talk about, and why should leaders be aware of this?
Brilliant. Okay, so let's start with sociopath. Sociopath is a really simple definition. It's just somebody who either doesn't feel or can't feel empathy. That's the simplest definition. Now, to the medical professionals and clinical psychologists out there, I'll be the first to accept it isn't in the DSM anymore. They're now called personality disorders. It's a sub-branch of that. So just to be clear with everyone in the audience, it is a pop cultural term. Psychologists will still use it. The definitions are a bit more fluffy, I guess. But in this context, and I think in normal conversation, you can just define it as somebody who doesn't feel empathy or can't feel empathy. Now, the dark five, these are sort of considered the five nasty personality types, and they're highly correlated. So if you have one, you're likely to have the others. So the dark five are sociopathy, so people without empathy or lack of empathy. The Machiavellians, these are the people which are political players. So this is Nicholas Machiavelli, wrote The Prince. I think it's 16th century Florence. He was a very savvy political player, a very manipulative political player. The sadists, these are the people who enjoy inflicting pain on people. The spiteful, so these are the ones that find it very hard to let go of something. They're going to hold revenge. If you slight them, or it doesn't even have to be a real slight, it can be perceived slight. They will make it their mission to come and hunt you down and pay you back. And the last is the narcissist. Everything's about me.
You talk about spitefulness as particularly destructive. Can you give us like a concrete example? What would that look like inside a leadership team?
So the problem you get in leadership is sociopathy, the sociopath side of it is actually incredibly useful. And when you get up to sort of C-suite level, where when you're looking at CEOs and COOs and CFOs and that kind of level, they either are diagnosable sociopaths or they have learnt to behave like one. It is not possible to sack 100 people and still feel empathetic about it. You actually have to start dissociating. So it is a necessary skill at the top levels. The problem with these dark five is that they're highly correlated. And in the lower levels, so particularly in sort of team leader, entry level management type levels, what you'll
Mm,
find is that someone has recognized and promoted someone because of the sociopathic skills, whether they realize it or not.
okay.
But you're then going to find some of these other negative personality types creeping in. And the ones that really stick out to me is the sadist and the spitefulness.
Mm,
So I fairly open-minded and willing to accept that people see the world in a different way than I do.
mhm.
And the best I've tried, I have not been able to come up with an example where a sadistic or a spiteful personality type is useful in a business.
Okay, interesting.
Where a
Mm,
narcissist who's constantly self-promoting, that does actually have a role, that can be useful. A Machiavellian who's politically manipulative, that can be useful. And as I've
mm.
already said, a sociopath is extremely useful.
You make a distinction that I find fascinating that is quite rare, is that sociopaths are often easier to manage, and you've alluded to it here, easier to manage and easier to work with than middle sort of mixed trait managers, sort of Machiavellian narcissists. And you started unpacking that for us. But what makes this middle management the more dangerous zone? And what makes sociopaths, I'm going to put it in inverted commas, Jonathan, easier to work with?
So the middle group is the more diverse group, technically.
Mm,
They're the group that will have more interesting personalities and more diverse, including those dark five, but also other personalities. So my specialty is in these sort of extreme personality types, but
mm,
there's lots of other personality types and disorders you can talk about, sort of autism, or even ignoring the diagnosable ones, just things like you have very social, extroverted people versus
mm,
introverted people.
mm,
So that middle management layer, you will find that there's quite an extreme diversity of different personality types. What they'll all have in common is that they're ambitious. They said yes to a management role and they were probably gunning for it for a while. So that's the only thing I can really say concrete about that group. Everything else makes them quite interesting and diverse. And because of that, it's very hard to sort of come up with concrete rules of saying you should do this in your career or do that in your career, because it really does depend on the person. It depends on how they're thinking, what's driving them. Now, as you go up the rank, you'll find that you'll get sort of stronger sociopathy and less of everything else. And that's when people become a lot more predictable. And what's fun with that sort of C-suite level is most of them rose through the ranks and sort of experience this sort of personality diversity type stuff and are quite good at hiding their sociopathic tendencies. Is that some of them may not even be intellectually aware of it, and the ones that are have learned to sort of keep it undercover. And I've had incredible success in my career of just calling it out. Now, obviously, you don't go into a meeting and declare the CEO as a
okay,
sociopath. That's a terrible bit of career advice.
that's not good
But
for that's good.
perhaps don't insult your boss. But just like, because a lot of my background, a lot of my work was IT and change management.
Hmm.
And as a general rule, we get the IT stuff right. We get the people side of change management wrong. When most change management projects fail, it tends to be the people side that was wrong. I've seen a few where it's technology, but 90-10, like
Mm,
90% of the time, it was a technology person with a great idea who completely misunderstood people,
mm,
and it went wrong. I've had lots of conversations where you're working with whoever your sponsor is. Maybe it's a COO
mm.
or someone very senior who's driving this change project. And it becomes very obvious very quickly that they'll have whatever the corporate reason is. We're replacing this system because we think it's going to make us more efficient, which will then save us money, which will then help shareholders, or whatever the justification is. And that's very rarely why they're doing it personally.
Yeah, of course.
And with a sociopath, just ask them. Ask them. They'll actually tell you. The nice thing about being a contractor is that I'm outside of the corporate structure. And if I go to you and go, okay, Susie, you brought me in to do this. Technology side, that's fine. We can make that happen. The politics side, I can see what's going on here. That shouldn't be an issue. But what's in it for you? What are you trying to get out of this? Like, are you trying to consume somebody else's department? Is this a power grab thing? Is this an undermining thing?
Are they surprised by your question, which is quite a direct question?
You always get this big smile and look of concern, and then 20 seconds later, they process it and they realize it's a genuine question, and then just out it comes. You end up with this incredibly brutal, honest answer. Yeah, the director of customer services is an absolute pain in the ass. I've been really irritated with him for years, and I want to consume his department. What we
Mm,
really want to do is take this, and this team off of him. It's like,
mm,
okay, now that you've told me that, I can actually work with you and I can help you with your objective.
mm. And do you think they would react in the same way if you were part of their system? Because, as you said, it's easier in inverted commas because you're a contractor and you're on the outside. But what is the effect of living in that system with them?
There's a lot less risk having those conversations with me. As a contractor, you can sack me on the spot. Most of my contracts, you pay me to the end of the hour. That's my notice period.
Mm,
So there's a safety in having that conversation with an outsider. With an insider, I'm not aware of anyone raising, or certainly being as direct as I am. That being said, I've seen lots and lots of internal players which are aware of this and picking up on it and reading between the lines. Maybe they didn't have the direct conversation. The other bit about contracting is I'm usually only there for 3 months.
yeah.
And if we've got 3 months to make this happen, I don't have 3 months of courting with you and working out exactly how you behave and what sort of, let's just get to the point. What do you want? Let's see if we can make this happen.
And basically, you ground all of this in evolutionary psychology. So, understanding the biology of the behaviors and that it matters for how leaders respond to them. So, if these traits have evolutionary roots, does that mean, Jonathan, for you, that no amount of culture building or team building can ever eliminate them?
Correct. This is so fundamental to how we behave. It's not even human things. You see it in the other great apes. You
Mm,
see it in dogs. You see it in all sorts of places. Any social thing. Yeah, I've heard it argued that you can track it back to fish. I have read the paper. It's a little tenuous, but there are academics out there that will argue you can get it that far back in evolutionary history. But it certainly predates anything we'd call human. So
mm,
yes, this is a very, very fundamental driver. And I think it's a huge mistake to ignore that. And just sort of a side note on evolutionary psychology, it's probably the most underestimated bit of academia. It's an area which is absolutely true and fascinating, but has become deeply unpopular
mm.
because it can be used for justifications for very nasty behavior. It can also be used for absolutely mad justifications. Well, one of my favorite sort of bits of evolutionary psychology is this theory that women wear red lipstick to symbolize ripe fruit and to make men more attracted to it. And your reaction is exactly how most people react. That's a sensible reaction to hear that. So there is some mad stuff in evolutionary psychology, but this concept of these are behaviors which predate humans is actually really important. When we evolve into societies and bigger groups, I'm not saying that we should go back to our primitive behaviors, but to ignore them is a mistake. Yes, we have a layer of culture and society that goes on top of it, but do remember that you're fighting an urge. There's a primal driver there, and to ignore it is a huge mistake.
Yeah, and of course, we spend a lot of our time in organizations in fight or flight, in a defensive, reactive mode, because that's what the conditions and the environments create. So, of course, you're right. You go back to, let's call it evolutionary states, hunter gatherer. I need to survive. I'm going to do this. I'm not necessarily going to step out and think about it.
It's also all the stuff that's in there that we dominance and submission is a really fascinating concept to
Mm,
unpack. And just if anyone who's ever owned two dogs, just watch two dogs interact with each other. And when we say dominance and submission, we always like either we're imagining a bedroom scenario or we're imagining one person bullying the other person.
mm,
And that's not how the game works. So if a bigger, stronger dog keeps beating up the smaller dog, what will happen is the smaller dog will distance itself and stop playing. And they lose a friend, in inverted commas. So there's actually a real balance of power and how that plays out. So if you think about the most sort of powerful people you've ever met in your life, they're not people running around bullying and dominating constantly, even when they can be incredibly dominant. There's a ratio you have to hit, and it's roughly 1 to 3. So the bigger dog has to let the smaller dog win 1 in 3 times. Otherwise, the game stops. And this is true in children. This is true in corporations.
And like you say, people just fall away. They disengage. They take that intentional decision to disengage. Can you walk me through the actual mechanics of, I'm leading a transformation, the board and the senior leadership team is asking me questions, my team's overwhelmed, my budget's under pressure. Where is the sociopathic playbook being played against me? And maybe I'm not seeing it. You talk about various things in the book: withholding information, psychological warfare, systems exploitation. Can you walk us through how that might show up?
In all sorts of places, and a lot of the time people don't recognize it even after it's happened to them. And that was the important bit in the book, was going, look, there are lots of different versions of manipulation and power games. And we can all think of one or two will naturally come to mind for everyone. Sort of going back to the evolutionary stuff, there's a really interesting difference between boys and girls here. So in society, we've equalized the sexes to a huge extent. Everyone's allowed to play, which is great. With areas which are encouraged and spoken about, so for example, IT or engineering, that there would have been a time where it would go, well, no, that's a boy's job, not a girl's job. And there would have been a discouraging of equal sexes. So things sort of academic and technical were actually quite good at equalizing and sharing knowledge. But one of the interesting sort of effects of the sort of dark five and sociopathy is we don't talk about it. So it's actually one of the areas where you see the bigger difference between men and women, because they're not talking to each other and sharing their experiences. And the thing that became really apparent was there's a girl half of the book and a boy half of the book. So like the female techniques are they could be rudely described as badly behaved schoolgirl stuff. So this is things like spreading rumors, reputation damage, exclusion. These things happen at a very senior level, and they can kill and undermine projects. Boy techniques tend to be a little bit more technical. They're more likely to rely on surveillance equipment. They're more likely to change contracts. They're likely to catch you on a technicality. They're less likely to use a social trick. So I'd start by going, okay, look, we've got the whole pile of different areas that people can behave badly. Start by recognizing what they are. Just purely on your sex, you're likely to have an advantage in one or the other, because that's the way you're more likely to think. So absolutely be aware of the other sex and what they get up to. But also look at all of it. Once you're then aware of, okay, there is a bunch of different traps here, and you start looking for it, you'll find that they're actually everywhere. And even people which are not sociopathic, but are just trying to get a project done, you'll be amazed how often you'll see one of these tricks being played out. And they may not even be aware of it. It's just become so much of the culture.
I think the DE&I chapter in the book, the gender discussion is generally provocative because you describe inclusion initiatives being weaponized. Can you tell me a little bit more about that dynamic?
So I was on a project. So again, my background's IT, and it's no secret IT is still a very male area, and it's hand on heart. It's nothing to do with us gatekeeping. It's just the CVs that come through. I'll recognize a female name, maybe 1 in 30. It's that kind of ratio. So it's nothing deliberate at all. And because I hang out in the IT department, when diversity and inclusion programs hit a company, it's always IT that gets hit hard, going, guys, what's happening here? You're 95% male. You need to do something.
Like the other technical areas in engineering.
It's hard. It is actually hard to balance it. So I was consulting for quite a well-known bank in the UK, and I was taking this job very, very seriously. I was like, okay, you want to try and equalize the numbers a bit. What can we do to attract more females into IT, into these roles? We were struggling. And anyway, the COO sort of pulled me aside and went, John, you're not getting it, are you? I'm like, well, what do you mean? And it's like... And he basically explained why companies like this bank are so big on DEI. And he basically said that there are 4 reasons. So the first is the more diverse your workforce is, the less likely they are to support each other. So we have a natural tendency, if I can see you in me, if you remind me of me or my family or people I am close to, I'm much more likely to protect you. I'm much more likely to go, oh, you remind me of this person.
Yeah, affinity bias.
You are my kin. Where if there is diversity, even if the team's very, very functional and happy and socializes together, they're much, much less likely to unionize. They're much less likely to support each other. They're much more likely to tolerate bullying from outside of the team. So diversity decreases pay. Diverse teams are more likely to think differently, which is a positive and a negative. When you get into big corporations, especially at lower levels, I actually don't want you thinking differently. I want you to be a machine. I want you to operate the same way. So the more diverse the team is, the more processes and procedures I have to put in, and we have to standardize the way you work. Now, that's the first step for offshoring, and it's also the first step for AI. So we've got this, it reduces pay, and we've now done the heavy lifting for outsourcing. The next one is marketing. So obviously, as a bank, I can turn around and say, look, aren't we amazing? We've hit these wonderful DEI figures. Aren't we a good people? Come and bank with us. And then the final one is sort of an interesting side shoot of the marketing side. So most of your listeners will have some form of pension, superannuation, retirement plan. You'll have your money probably with some sort of asset manager or pension fund or something like that. And these companies will, hopefully once a year in the UK, talk to you and say, okay, Susie, you've got your investment. We have your retirement here. What do you want to invest in? And on that list will be things like companies that are ethical and good for the environment and diverse, etc., and DEI type quotas. So as a CEO, the single-handed quickest thing I can do to increase share price is things like DEI, because now more of the institutions will invest in the shares, which then pushes up the share price. So it's an incredibly cynical, dark way of looking at it. And I wouldn't have believed it until someone literally pulled me aside and bollocked me for it and actually went, John, you're just not getting this. We hired you because we thought you would understand this.
Yeah, which brings me to, you described something called the hero ideology cultivation. Can you describe what that is and how leaders get played by it?
Well, it's all about sort of branding. It slightly overlaps with the narcissism. I think the differentiation between, let's go back a step. So sort of this hero brand concept is this idea of come and talk to me. It's basically what's happening here. I'm talking to your listeners and hopefully they're finding it interesting and understanding something or educating them. But there's also sort of a secondary thing going on here where your listeners are hopefully listening to me and going, oh, this guy's actually quite competent. We have this problem. Perhaps I should go talk to him. There is a game that's been played going, look, come and talk to me. I'm a professional. I actually know what I'm doing. One of the sort of interesting quirks between the narcissist and the sociopath is the narcissist does it because they have to. The sociopath is doing it because it's in their benefit. So the quickest way to tell is when it isn't in your interest. So again, playing the victim is kind of the opposite side of this. Oh, Susie, you're being mean to me. I'm just this poor little innocent boy in country Australia, and you're bullying me. I'm effectively doing the opposite. And what you'll find is that a narcissist really struggles to do that. Where a sociopath will quite quickly turn that on when it suits them.
Yeah, and it's interesting because that's the whole branding with the hero ideology, the whole link of why we're doing it was my link to the DEI discussion, which I think is cynical but true, and that's how it plays out. And it brings me to sort of an antidote. You have a concept called the I love you, I hate you meeting. And I just wanted to talk about that because it sounds radical, but also because it's interesting, I think, in how it works and how leaders can use it consciously to navigate that environment.
So the background of this is blowing my own trumpet here. I think I'm actually quite good at team leadership. I have people that follow me from contract to contract. When I leave, there's people that want to go wherever I've gone, which I think is the biggest compliment you can get as a manager. And I sat through sermon after sermon of let's do a 360-degree reviews, let's do this, let's try and team build. And the reality is if you're doing this once a quarter, you've done it wrong. This isn't how you build good teams. It's about personal connections. It's about training and mentorship, but probably mentorship is the most important word. One of the most powerful team building things I've ever done, and this only works if your team is already good. So if you're starting from scratch and you've got a 2 out of 10 sort of connected team, do not do this. You will absolutely destroy it. But if you're sitting at a 6, 7 out of 10, this will get you up to an 8 or a 9. This is your final bit. And I call it the I love you, I hate you meeting. And once a month, everyone, including managers and team leaders, will sit in a group and everyone has to say 3 things about each person that they're doing well and 3 things that they're doing badly. The I love you and I hate you bit. And then we take a little bit of time at the end of going, okay, Susie, we've got 10 of us in the room. All of them have said you're doing ABC well. Congratulations. That seems to be the consensus. But they've also said XYZ is your weak point. What can we do to help you? So it's a group form of criticism, which is great if you trust that person. If you've got a relationship where you can be criticized, and most of us will have that sort of relationship with our partners. I think that's a sign of a good, healthy, loving relationship. If you can tell your partner, or they can tell you, look, John, I think you're actually doing this wrong here. You're upsetting people. You're being obnoxious or whatever. If you can hear that without taking it personally and going, actually, no, Susie isn't saying this to upset me. She's saying this to help me. But this is why you do not do this at a 2 out of 10 level. If you've got a team that isn't quite formed yet and is not quite there, you'll destroy things. You'll actually destroy it. It's a very dangerous move, but it is the final piece to the motivation puzzle.
Yeah, and I think it brings me to sort of the final part of the book, which I think most leaders will skip to immediately and probably should, is, it's about what does genuine defense look like for any leader who wants to operate with integrity. And the mentoring piece of, ethical mentoring is one of your suggestions for operating with integrity. Can you take us through other things we can do to operate with integrity in this type of environment? Because your example there, the speak up culture, what does a speak up culture actually need to hold when someone with serious dark traits is in that room?
It's really difficult to answer. So there are lots of things like the speak up culture, the accountability recording stuff, really good logs. These are all things that create a lovely sort of paperwork trail. And when someone does something nasty, you've got this sort of line of evidence of how they got there. I think that there's this kind of 2 ways of looking at it. One of them is we have this ideology of there shouldn't be sociopaths in business. Therefore, let's try and force the business to operate in a non-sociopathic way. And the issue with that is you do need sociopaths in business, and all you're going to do is push them underground. I have a very controversial view on hate speech. I would really like people to say it because then I know exactly who you are. The last thing I want to do is say, no, you can't say that. And then your bigoted views become hidden from me. It's sort of the sociopathic stuff. It's like actually sort of this sort of cultures and discouraging it becomes quite tricky. You'll potentially increase it and you'll certainly make it more dangerous because it will be better hidden.
Yeah, it just drives it further underground. And, the whole idea about, I think it's very familiar to all our listeners to have a conversation with someone and then they'll send you an email just recapping what they've said. And essentially, sometimes it's just to cover them and to have what you call paper trails. But high functioning sociopaths, we were chatting before the show and you said, they develop their own ethical codes, Jonathan. How do you know when you can rely on that code and when you can't?
So this is a really interesting one. If you're looking for a way to identify a sociopath, someone who talks about ethics and morals is a really, really, really good clue. So for most of us sort of living our happy lives, we don't really think about this stuff. We just instinctively know that we don't murder people. Killing people is bad. That's a moral rule. We've never really bothered to unpack that intellectually. For a sociopath who doesn't have the empathy part of their brain working, they don't really have the logical reason why this is wrong. I shouldn't murder someone because it will hurt them. Well, that's not an argument because I don't feel empathy. So what is there? I'll get caught and go to jail. That's a pretty good argument. But you can see that they're now having to justify this in a way that hopefully most of your listeners wouldn't justify it that way. So someone who talks about morals and ethics is an interesting clue. And my experience of high-functioning sociopaths is that because they don't have a standard set of ethics, they don't have these rules built on a natural level, they've had to intellectualize them. And they, to be successful, have had to spend a huge amount of time intellectualizing them and have actually really created the entire world's morals and ethics code from scratch. And this is where you'll end up with these sort of really interesting justifications, sort of needs of the many versus the needs of the few type arguments. This is justified because of this. I'm allowed to do this negative thing because we get this benefit. And that's something that a normal person will actually really, really struggle with. So teaching morals and ethics as a way of countering it, I'm actually not sure would help. Because again, all you're doing is you're educating a sociopath saying, as a group, we've decided murder is wrong. they've probably already worked that out. And if they haven't, all you're doing is just correcting their model.
Yeah, and that's why I like the idea of going right back to the beginning of our discussion of understanding the evolutionary patterns of behavior and being able to actually notice and then understand what's going on, because only then, if I move to the end of the playbook, can we actually look at what would suit us as a way of working around that, keeping our value base and our ethics and stepping into it anyway, because the work needs to be done and we need to collaborate. And it brings me to AI. And, you were saying that Cambridge Analytica spent years building, and that someone with the right AI tools can now replicate that in a weekend or a matter of days.
So this is where I started. This is a story I tell right at the beginning of the book. And
Yeah.
so my background, as I keep saying, is IT and computer science. And there are different types of computer scientists. There are ones that focus on computer stuff like AI or how to store data more efficiently, or quantum computing, and the really geeky side of computers. And there's some incredible geniuses out there, very, very impressive. But there's a second group of computer scientists, which is what I am. And these are the ones that use computers to solve other people's problems. So it might be you've got a theory about vibrations in aeroplane wings. And in my early career, if you needed 10,000 computers to run a physics simulation to calculate the vibration in an airplane wing by making this slight change to its shape, it was someone like me that you'd come and talk to, and we'd work out a way to program your experiment. So one of my early bits of experimental programming was in psychological forensics. So the original idea was to take dating websites and to try and build models of how to sell to people. So this is when people write, I'm XYZ looking for ABC. You actually give away a huge amount of information there. Sort of the interesting thing about dating websites is sex is obviously a very primal driver. This
Yeah.
is, well, it's the reason we're all here, whether we want to admit it or not. It's incredibly primal. And when people start writing about what they're looking for in a partner, you get an insight to them that you wouldn't normally get. So we did this big project where, in the simplest version, you've got like logical buyers and emotional buyers. So if I'm trying to sell you a Ferrari and I say logically it does 0 to 60 in 2 seconds, and it's got these amazing tires with some special clever design, versus this car is incredibly sexy and beautiful. People will look at you, they'll think you're cool, they'll admire you for driving it. So that's an example of two different sales strategies for different personality types. We had a big discussion between the psychologists and the computer scientists, and what became very apparent is the psychologists didn't have an agreed model. They didn't have a way of going, there are these types of people in the world, and this is how we're going to define them and work that out. So the computer scientists are actually quite happy and okay with this. What we do is called a statistical cluster model. So we collect all the interesting data, we then start dividing it up into unique groups, and then we have these mathematical groups, but we don't know what they are. We started with the most extremely different, statistically different group. And it turned out we'd actually identified sociopaths. And that's what started my whole interest in this area. To go to the Cambridge Analytica bit. So these are guys that in 2016 were heavily involved in using those types of technologies with political manipulation. So these are groups that, whether you believe it or not, are credited for getting Trump into power, Brexit, and Boris. All three have supposedly used Cambridge Analytica. I'm going to say allegedly. I don't think it is allegedly. It did make it to the newspapers, but I will put a little caveat in there. And the bit that scares me, and sort of where your question came from, we're talking about AI in a sort of pre-interview discussion, pre-podcast discussion. And there are lots of things that scare me about AI, about replacing jobs in the economic and the political side of it. But the bit that really scares me is just how much an average person can do. So Cambridge Analytica was groundbreaking at the time, and that's 10 years ago now. If I was to recreate Cambridge Analytica by myself, I reckon I could do it in a weekend with AI. The tools I have and the equipment I have in this house would be enough to do it. And that's the scary bit.
Well, it's totally scary. And I also think, AI reduces outside influence and gives individuals more direct control. If I look at exactly what you're saying, how does that feed narcissistic or sociopathic patterns? Because that's what's scary for me as well about AI in the context of this discussion.
There's all sorts of work of trying to make AI ethical. And I've heard it argued many times that the biggest challenge, the biggest computer science problem of AI at the moment isn't intelligence, it isn't reasoning, It's actually knowing what the user wants. And you
Yes.
may just be going into ChatGPT going, "Can you give me a recipe for scones?" That's a relatively straightforward, simple problem. But if we say something like, "I've got this challenging situation at work. I work with a lady called Judy, and she's driving me insane, and she's talking about me behind my back. What do I do?"
Mm.
There is sort of an agreed ethical version of that answer, and then there's an answer that you might find in my book, which is perhaps a little less ethical. And I'm not even gonna say one's right and one's wrong, but they're both valid answers.
Yeah.
And there's a huge amount of effort in AI to try and censor one and keep the other. And it shows. And these companies are getting it wrong in sort of really embarrassing ways. My favorite example of this was one of Google's early image creation AIs. You'd say, "Can you give me a picture of Henry VIII?" And as part of its diversity rules, it would give you a black Henry VIII. I'm pretty confident that Henry VIII was a white guy, and I think most historians would agree with that. I don't think this one's up for debate.
No.
Now, I get where this rule is coming from because it's saying, "Give me an image of 5 people having a barbecue, enjoying a nice Sunday afternoon." That rule will play into that, and it will give you a nice diverse image with different races and sexes and ages, etc. So I understand where the logic came from.
Mm.
But obviously, in the example of "Give me a picture of Henry VIII," it went too far. You misunderstood the problem.
I mean, I think it's interesting, and you in the book you talk about, accelerating power dynamics in organizations through digital IDs, reduced anonymity, and things like that. It's a whole different podcast. But if you were advising a senior leader right now on this, what would your guardrails be? What would you tell them to pay attention to, given the different levels of organizations, given the different levels of accountability that this tool, generative AI, can actually open for them?
It is moving so quickly. Just the stuff we're doing at Nexoid, the things that we're doing this month versus 3 months ago is almost completely different. Giving you hard and set rules saying, "Behave this way, do this, do that. This is the policy that will save you." There is so much risk in slowing you down. The fastest movers in AI will be the ones that will be successful. This is a level of change that I don't think the world's ever seen. Certainly, I've never seen. And I'm don't like admitting this, but I'm old enough to remember the dot-com bust. So this is a whole different world. It is really quite scary how quickly it's moving. There are some very good sort of basic principles of any kind of big system architecture. You should be logging, you should be recording, and you should be monitoring. So I guess my advice would be anyone working for a big corporation bringing in agentic or any other sort of clever AI systems, it absolutely must be logged. It must be tracked back to a user, and it must be someone's job to actually review those logs. I'll be the first to admit that you're going to catch the problem after it's happened,
Yeah.
which is obviously not ideal, but I'm not sure that you can do it any other way. If you're trying to
No.
catch the problem before it happens, you're likely to solve the wrong problem. You're likely to waste a lot of time, and you'll probably fall behind and lose competitiveness.
Mm. And if I link that back to the dark five personality traits, what does that mean? What should we be looking out for? Because there's a certain amount of withholding information that can no longer be done.
Again, it's the analysts that are going through it, and I think we like to train business analysts on business process problems,
Mm.
and that's useful. There's value in that. That is definitely part of the job. Something I think we're terrible at in IT in general, but especially business analysts, is the psychology. It's understanding the basic human drivers, why someone's doing it, recognizing a pattern of behavior. You've got so many different versions of this outside of even my areas. And sort of cognitive dissonance is like a whole area in itself.
Mm.
And if you've got a business analyst that can recognize that quickly, that's actually quite useful. What's going on? Susie's running a team and she's constantly using the AI to get around whatever process.
Mm.
Why is she doing that? And maybe there's a very good reason why. Maybe that process is completely ridiculous and should be retired. Maybe that's the answer. But to recognize that. So I have a client at the moment and they have an accounts payable system which is not fit for purpose. And their office team is currently copy and pasting large amounts of corporate data into ChatGPT and saying, "Look, line this up and reconcile it for us," ignoring all the GDPR rules and everything else they're breaking. what it does show is that they've got a technical problem. This is the way that they solved it. And an analyst should be reading that and going, guys, we actually have a serious issue here. We have GDPR breaches happening daily en masse. We need a better system. And the answer is replace the damn accounts payable system. Like it's it's not fit for purpose. That's the obvious solution. But it's amazing how quickly we ignore that stuff. I think the advantage of these AIs is that they're actually quite easy to log and track. That being said, we're actually selling AI automation in South Australia at the moment, and I'm not aware of any of the competitors that are actually logging stuff. They're solving the business need very quickly, but it's all been done very dirtily with a sort of a bit of duct tape and going, look, ta-da, problem solved. And the logging and the auditing side is missing.
Okay, which would also give the digital equivalent of the paper trail.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And to go back a sec, I helped my ex quite a lot in his career, and he would regularly bring home corporate data to share at the dinner table. Now, this is something he shouldn't do, but also helped him. And I see lots of sensitive stuff, which I managed to forget. But it's an example of this stuff happens anyway. The nice thing about you doing it with the AI is we know who you spoke to. We know that it's logged. We know what you gave them. The whole thing is very, very clear.
Yeah, it brings more transparency and with that more ethics because things are on the table. Just a final question. Imagine senior leaders listening to this, teams under pressure, and they've just recognized someone in their inner circle through this conversation, Jonathon, of the fact that they sort of suspected and they saw what was going on, but now they have an explanation, the formalization of it, so they can step out of the sort of hypervigilance of I'll just push through. What do they do? What would you advise them to do? Where do they start, Jonathon, in trying to deal with what they've just recognized?
Well, it depends on what they've recognized. If it's spiteful or sadist, I think there's a very good argument to get rid of them. These are not people you want in the business. They are going to be bad. Now, if you've got one of the other three, recognize the patterns, learn the drivers, and learn to work with them. If I could leave people with a message, one thing I really dislike, and almost every other book on this topic has this sort of view of sociopaths are evil, we should exterminate them from society. And this really irks me. It's not right for business. It's not right for finance. It's not right for pensioners. It is a really bad idea on lots of levels. And it's the people who are talking about neurodiversity and being inclusive that seem to be saying this. Like, we're perfectly okay with dyslexia. We're perfectly okay with ADHD. We're perfectly okay with autism. But if someone's a bit Machiavellian, that must be evil. And this sort of sums up a whole pile of areas. If I could give a message to both leaders and corporations, accept these people. They have value. Do put in safety systems around them. Do put in education. Educate up and down. Make sure everyone is aware of these concepts. And you'll actually all get on a lot better and be a lot more productive. If you try and alienate and attack these people, as a general rule, they win. I have seen high-profile sociopaths go down, but it's rare. I've certainly got an address book full of ones where they've survived 10, 15, 20 big attacks and they're still there. These people will be better at the game than you are. So I know that sounds very threatening, but that's why they're valuable.
I think I'm going to leave our listeners with that. It just takes me back to the need to review how we build up leadership competence and what we put in there, and the whole evolutionary psychology, anthropology, and understanding of the human is even more important as we step into the AI era that you've just discussed. I mean, Jonathon, this has been one of those conversations that I've been thinking about for a very long time. Just like when I read your book, I'm still thinking about it, not because it was comfortable, but because it wasn't comfortable. And if it wasn't comfortable, it was because there was growth opportunities there, but also things that I haven't been formalizing that we don't talk about in society. It's that honesty. And in the business of leadership, honesty is often a rare currency. That's my biggest takeaway, is what you see is never what you get. And we know that. But the final part of how we can counter that with our own ethical behavior was really powerful for me. And I'm still thinking about that. So thank you for coming and sharing your insights and your experience and your theories. Where can people find out more about you, Jonathon, and your book and what you do?
So if you're looking for me in the IT and consulting side, it's Nexoid, NEXOID.com. Happy to talk to everyone. And on the book side, it's corporatesociopathhandbook.com. It's available on Amazon. It's available on Kindle, Google Books, everywhere, Apple. It's everywhere.
Okay. I'll put the links in the show notes so that our listeners can find it. And I will leave them with an invitation to go and read it, but to read every chapter and to think about how uncomfortable it is when we recognise what we're reading. Thank you, Jonathan. Thanks for a great conversation.
Thank you very much for having me.
So the Corporate Sociopath Handbook, and I'm going to say that I think every transformation leader should read it. Not because your organisation is full of sociopaths, but because the moment you understand the game, you can make the noise quieter and the chaos becomes less random and more manageable. And therefore you can start leading with a lot more clarity. If this conversation sparks something for you, if you're sitting in the middle of a transformation that feels harder than it should, if you're sitting there thinking politics are louder than what we're actually getting done, or if you just need a clear-eyed conversation about what's actually going on in your organisation, please feel free to reach out to me. The link's in the show notes. And until then,